Ave Maris Stella.
Hello and welcome back to Vatican II in a Year. This is your host, Father Matthew Schneider. I'm a priest of the Legionaries of Christ and a theology professor. This is a podcast on the StarQuest Production Network at sqpn.com. Today, we're on day 228, a general overview to Dignitatis Humanae, an interview with Dr. Aaron Weldon of the USCCB. If you want to follow along, we have a reading plan and more details at sqpn.com/Vatican. So as you know, Vatican II has a number of documents, and we're going through them in this podcast in chronological order, which isn't perfectly in systematic order, but that was just the simplest way to do it. Today, the document is Dignitatis Humanae, which just means the dignity of the human and an implied person, the human person, right? Their dignity. Subtitle is on religious freedom, which is more descriptive than the title itself, I think. And it was approved by a vote of 2,308 to 70. So it's a little less unanimous than some of the other documents, but still over 90%. So the bishops are showing that unity. And so our guest today is Dr. Aaron Weldon. He's the Assistant Director for Religious Liberty at the USCCB, the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops. He has his PhD in systematic theology from Catholic University of America down there in D.C. He lives in North Brentwood, Maryland, which is a D.C. suburb, with his wife and children. So welcome to the podcast, Dr. Weldon.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
Excellent. Yeah, I know when we were prepping, you were saying you're more of the practical thing with working with the bishop, this is a little more theoretical, but we don't want to make it too academic. We want to make it for like the average Catholic in the pew who wants to know a little more. So hopefully we get it well. So to cover and introduce Dignitatis Humanae, we're going to cover 4 parts. We're going to talk about the history of the Catholic Church and religious liberty. We're going to talk some key themes, and we're going to talk about 2 aspects of the follow-up. First of all, the kind of traditionalist reaction, and second of all, the magisterium on religious liberty since Vatican II. So historically, the majority view is a little different regarding religious liberty from what the Vatican II says, what would be the majority today. In Christendom, it was often the belief called error has no rights. Can you explain the error has no rights view just a little bit?
Yeah, I think in general, what that phrase is meant to sum up is this idea that basically that non-Catholics would not have the right to practice their religion, or that non-Catholics would not have religious freedom. And so right there, you already kind of, as you're sort of alluding to, that this is the document in the Second Vatican Council that really, where you see the most kind of development, and that has tended to be the most controversial aftermath in a lot of ways. Just a couple of comments though on that notion that error has no rights. Like I said, it sort of sums up this idea that non-Catholics don't have a right to practice their religion. But I think it's helpful to focus on that language of right, because even in modern Catholic social teaching, we generally want to say that rights pair with duties or obligations, that rights and obligations go together. Sometimes you'll hear it talked about as reciprocal rights and obligations. So in that sense, I think we can still we can understand the idea that error in and of itself, that it wouldn't make sense to say that you have a right to error. Now there's more going on, and we'll kind of get there in a little bit, but that's one little point that I wanted to make. Also just want to point out something to keep in mind, is that, again, even with the Second Vatican Council, that Christians and Christian rulers have a duty to govern the political order in accordance with truth and justice. And so if the Catholic religion is true, and the Catholic religion has things to say about how society ought to be ordered, you can kind of see how it makes sense for rulers who favor the Catholic religion to see it, to think that it's their duty to suppress other religions in some way. So just in the sense of just trying to kind of understand where people from another time are coming from, that's, I think, part of what's going on, or something to consider.
Okay. One of the things that I think is important when we look at it also is the different forms of the different forms of government. There's a difference in how they conceive government in Christendom and how we conceive it in the modern nation state. Can you explain a little bit of more of how it was done back in historical Christendom and how that's different from modern nation state politics, which we're probably both all familiar with?
Yeah, I mean, I think first, if you start from very early on in Christianity across the ages has understood that there is a distinction between temporal authority and spiritual authority. So I think first to recognize that is kind of something new that Christianity brings, that Christianity brought to the world. Sometimes you hear it talked about in terms of this idea of two swords, which typically is associated with Pope Gelasius. Another way you can think about it is the notion that the offices of priest and king are two distinct and separate offices. So the king rules one realm, and the priest or the bishop rules another realm. So then the question becomes a matter of how are the authorities kind of coordinated with each other. So, Father, as you mentioned, historically in Christendom, there's a great deal of they're very tightly coordinated, the way that the king, the temporal authority and the spiritual authorities are very tightly coordinated. You could even say that there's sometimes some kind of blurring of the lines between the two authorities. Whereas as we get more into what we have come to the kind of state that we see today, you see a much more of a separation between the two authorities, but that can still go in different ways. One of the ways that kind of separation can happen is you can have a state that is just totally indifferent towards religion. And that's where I think when we're talk about 19th century popes, where that's where a lot of the controversies are with Dignitatis Humanae. I think that's one of the things that they're concerned about is governments that are totally indifferent about matters of religion. And then you can also imagine a state that has this kind of a certain kind of sovereignty, as we've come to understand it, that is exercising some functions that really more properly belong to spiritual authorities. There's sort of a state that oversteps its bounds. That can be a problem also. And so those are sort of the things that are kind of lingering in the background when we talk about teaching about religious liberty.
Yeah, so you mentioned kind of two errors there. One would be kind of the indifferentism in the 19th century, which we'll get into in just a minute. And then the other one was more the totalitarianism of the 20th century, where the state tries to be everything and control everything, including religion, which we think of most of all with communism, but was also present in other forms of 20th century dictatorships and totalitarian regimes.
Mm-hmm.
So
yeah, exactly.
Moving on to the 19th century, like Gregory the 16th and Pius the 9th both condemned that kind of religious liberty based on indifferentism. Do you want to explain that a little bit and explain that period about religious liberty as well?
Yeah, I'll say a little bit about it. And I mean, this is really where the main controversy is, because you can find these quotes, as you and I have discussed in preparing for this, that religious liberty and Mirari Vos by Pope Gregory the 16th talks about a kind of liberty of conscience as a pestilence more deadly to the state than any other. Pius the 9th in Quanta Cura, he picks up on some of these condemnations of religious liberty. So you have these kind of what seem to be explicit condemnations of religious liberty. And I think the question we want to ask ourselves is, what do they understand themselves to be condemning? What is what issues are in play? A scholar that I highly recommend for any listeners who are very interested in this topic is Michael Dunnigan. He's a canon law professor at St. Meinrad Seminary. Very good. He has a book published by Emmaus Press, Emmaus Academic, called Religious Liberty and the Hermeneutic of Continuity. I've found that to be one of the most helpful books on the topic. He talks about a couple of things. I'm, again, being very summary here, but he talks about the scope of religious freedom and this kind of distinction between the moral and juridical spheres. And so what he's saying is that in the 19th century, the popes could not, like, they saw the moral and the juridical, or what we might talk about as civil law, as being very tightly bound up with each other. So in other words, if something is wrong in the moral sphere, it wouldn't really make sense to consider it a right in terms of civil law. And that's something that obviously we're seeing some kind of a little bit of a change or a development. So that's one issue that's going on, is that the moral and the civil and the juridical are really, really tightly bound. And then another point he makes is that in the 19th century, the right to religious freedom is seen as a kind of a positive right, or it's an affirming the right to practice non-Catholic religions. But one of the things that's at issue is that many of these regimes did have toleration for non-Catholics, but the issue is whether or not you're going to talk about it in terms of toleration versus a right. And again, we get to that point about the error has no rights thing. It may be that error can be tolerated, but to say that a person has an affirmative right to error, seen as a problem, and I think that it's probably still seen as a problem. It's just these issues are framed differently in Dignitatis Humanae. A couple of other points, just to bring up, at this point about indifferentism that you raise. Again, there's actually, I think, more continuity than people appreciate on the topic. Like, if it's the case that religion is a natural part of being human, then a rightly ordered state, if it's going to promote the common good, can't be indifferent about religion. And so that's another issue that's going on, that you can't really promote the common good and just sort of leave religion off to the side if religion is a crucial part of the common good. One other figure that I would want to identify from the 19th century, but you can see where I'm going, is Pope Leo XIII. He raises some issues about the goal or the end of freedom in Libertas Praestantissimum. He says, and I'll quote here, he says, "The will cannot proceed to act until it is enlightened by the knowledge possessed by the intellect. In other words, the good wished by the will is necessarily good insofar as it is known by the intellect, and this the more because in all voluntary acts, choice is subsequent to a judgment upon the truth of the good presented." Now, the reason I raise that is, again, and you can see a theme, I'm trying to highlight continuity here, because I think even today there can be an issue with focusing on freedom and religious freedom as simply a matter of choice. I think if you ask, in fact, I recently was teaching a class. I teach as a side gig, and was and asked about, what is religious freedom, and that's almost, people say it's freedom to choose, and it's true that choice. There's an element of choice involved, but I sometimes think about it. I'm a convert to Catholicism, and when I converted, I didn't really feel like I was choosing. It was sort of the truth sort of presented itself to me, and I kind of had no choice. And so this notion of it of choice, it sometimes it gives the impression of you're choosing between fried chicken and barbecue or something, but that's not what we're talking about here, is a sort of being indifferent to there's a kind of priority of reason and intellect involved in the movement of the will and assenting to the truth. So again, this sense that it may be prudent for a government to allow citizens to make bad choices. But there's this focus, I think, more in the 19th century papal teaching where, they don't want to say that people have some natural moral right to choose just whatever. So that I think is part of what's going on there in the 19th century.
Oh yeah, definitely. And I think, like you're saying, your choice is not just this kind of superficial choice like fried chicken or hamburgers, but it's something deep in the person. This religion is much more of an identity issue in that sense. And so in the first half of the 1900s, the first half and a bit, coming up to the council, those first 63 years, I guess, of the 20th century, there were a few differences in how the church approached it, kind of speak to almost like a foretaste of Dignitatis Humanae. And I'd note, first of all, Mit Brendiger Sorge from Pius XII, which is his response to the Nazis. It's generally, it doesn't use the word Nazi, but it's generally considered as the main theme of it. And then John the 23rd and Pacem Terris. Could you explain a little bit about these documents or others and how they kind of prepare for what we have in Vatican II?
Yeah, I mean, just briefly, I would say that with you mentioned earlier, Father, when you're talking about different kinds of governments and regimes, this the possibility of totalitarian states, and I think you're starting to see here with Pius XII, but it's also something that's kind of in the background with the Council Fathers, the sense that these totalitarian states really degrade the dignity of the human person. So that's, I think, part of what you're getting a little bit of. You're also this sense that if we're going to, in order to talk about religious freedom in these totalitarian states, we want to have a good ground to stand on. So I think that's a little bit of what's going on there. And then I think when it comes to Pope John the 23rd, with this quote that you have that says, one must never confuse error and the person who errs, not even when there is question of error or inadequate knowledge of truth in the moral or religious field. The person who errs is always and above all a human being, and he retains in every case his dignity as a human person. I mean, that right there is, you're getting some of the language that's going to get picked up on in Dignitatis Humanae. And you will sometimes hear as sort of a pithy summary of what changed, this notion that, and because you brought up error has no rights. So you will sometimes hear as a pithy summary, people say, well, it was the case. It may be the case that error has no rights, but persons do have rights. That's sometimes the way people will put it. I'm not sure how happy I am with that pithy summary, but at least that is a way that people put it. And I do think, though, you are seeing this here, sort of a shift in focus from error and the choice for error, and a shifting towards a focus on the dignity of the human person. And so that really kind of tees things up for Dignitatis Humanae pretty well, I think.
Oh yeah, definitely. I've heard that pithy summary before too, and I get the same kind of, it's good, but not quite perfect there. So moving on to Dignitatis Humanae, we're talking about a few themes. I just have a few themes here. If you end up combining some of them, might not mention all the ones on the list on the kind of document I sent you beforehand with the list. But the first one is, how do we define religious liberty, and how does this document define it? Can you give that a little bit of thought?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think that's really key, is this, it defines it as immunity from coercion, which is really important in terms of the doctrinal development issue. earlier I mentioned that in the 19th century, that if religious liberty was thought of as an affirmation or something that's kind of like a positive right to something like error, here then it shifts, or the understanding of religious liberty is not that it's a positive right to error, but it's simply a right to not be coerced. So immunity from coercion, that kind of shifts the terms a little bit, and kind of helps us with the doctrinal development issue. And I think that a couple of things to note about this. First of all, I think when you put it that way, that it's primarily about immunity from coercion, that's what religious liberty is. Dignitatis Humanae, then when you really, despite the fact that it's been so controversial, I was just reading recently Russell Hittinger in a recent book that's like a collection of essays of his, and I mean, he points out that really Dignitatis Humanae is, it's important to respect its silences, is the way I think he puts it. That it doesn't really say a whole lot, like other than immunity from coercion. It doesn't lay out all the details of how church-state relationships ought to work. And so that's one thing that I think is important to remember. But one other thing to add to this, about what religious liberty is we focus a lot on religious liberty when we're often thinking about individuals, and maybe to some degree we get to thinking about communities. But it can be easy to forget that a key part of religious liberty is also the freedom of the church. And in number 13 of Dignitatis Humanae, it actually says quite a bit about the freedom of the church. And so that's another key part of it. I don't want to read the whole quote, and besides, you're going to read through it. But I'll just flag that for when you're reading through, to note how much it talks about freedom of the church, that the church has certain rights to fully engage in her ministry and mission, and Dignitatis Humanae is really big on that. So I'll stop there.
Oh yeah, definitely. That's the kind of thing that we definitely see there. That wasn't one of the themes that I listed there, but the kind of freedom of the church, or even of other groups like the Lutheran Church or the Buddhist temple or whatever else, would have a similar kind of liberty and to practice theirs as well, like the kind of not just individual but group liberty, religious liberty. Now it talks. I think we already covered the next two themes I listed, which is about how it's rooted in dignity. Now it's a response to secular totalitarian governments like communism. Did you want to say anything more on those two themes, or do you think we already covered them?
Well, yeah, I mean, to maybe to reiterate a little bit, I mean, I just think it's important, the anthropology here, that, the human person has a natural inclination to seek the truth about God, right? And so that it's part of our dignity as human beings that we have intellect, we have will, we have conscience, we have prudence to seek out the answers to these sorts of basic human questions, like that, why do we exist, and how do we respond to the Creator, and what happens when we die, and these sorts of things. And so, if you think about the truth as something that, in a way, almost like impresses itself on us when we're sincerely seeking. And in fact, Dignitatis Humanae says that we have an obligation to seek the truth. So that's why I talked about the rights and duties pairing themselves with each other, or have their reciprocal rights and duties. The right to religious liberty is paired with this obligation to seek the truth in matters of religion, and that true freedom is a matter of being of seeking after the truth and finding it, and resting in the truth. And so, one of the things I think then is just very important with the point about human dignity is that a true act of faith involves an assent that must be freely made, right? That it's to exercise our faculties that are proper to us as humans. That's what Dignitatis Humanae is trying to respect. And so for a temporal authority to coerce an act of faith, I mean, in a way, it's sort of short-circuiting the natural order of things. And so I think that's part of what's going on with what Dignitatis Humanae is trying to protect here.
Yeah, and so I think we have a pretty good outline here. There's one theme I think which is important, which is kind of like the limits on religious liberty. Somebody might object saying, well, what if this or that religion wants to do human sacrifice or something like that?
Mm-hmm.
And what does the document talk about when it mentions some kind of limits that would say, no, you can't do human sacrifice or something like that, right? Because I think we all agree that something like that would be not allowed.
Yeah, I mean, it's very clear that religious freedom is not some absolute right. And even today in our advocacy, which is most of the work that I'm involved in, I mean, we never would advocate religious freedom as just some trump card that says we can do anything if we claim religious freedom for it. As Dignitatis Humanae says, the state can regulate religious practice if that's what's necessary to maintain just public order. The state has a responsibility to maintain public peace, to take basic steps to ensure that civil society can flourish. And so certainly, it's not the case that you still have to, these are kind of like the core elements of what's necessary to be able to promote the common good, this notion of just public order. And so, a religious practice that would violate those things is certainly an area where the state can come in and could put limits on religious practice in those sorts of instances. Now, these things are always kind of messy in real life, but that's still the guiding principle.
Okay, excellent. Yeah. So moving on to after Vatican II, we have kind of two aspects. First of all, I want to just deal a little bit with the traditionalist Catholics, because within Catholic circles, this is one of the things that, they bring up a number of objections. And really, this document, more than Sacrosanctum Concilium or anything else, is the stumbling block for the full reintegration of the Society of St. Pius X, the SSPX. And it's been the main issue in talks from them, fully becoming fully united with the church right now. We're not going to get to the canon law of exactly how they're kind of united with the church, but not fully. It's a whole other issue. But the whole issue is, would you want to explain what their position is here a little bit, and maybe give a response to it? What the SSPX might say, and what we might respond to them on this document?
I mean, I think just in very general terms, you have in some of the documents we identified, Mirari Vos, Quanta Cura, you have what appear to be fairly straightforward condemnations of religious liberty or freedom of conscience. And then in Dignitatis Humanae, you have what seems to be pretty straightforward promotion of religious liberty and freedom of conscience. And so you can, it's fairly easy, to find passages and say these appear to be in conflict. I think, part of how I try to it's obvious that I've sort of, in my own intellectual formation, has been one that tries to emphasize like a hermeneutic of continuity, and that's sort of my habit of reading these things. And so I think that if you read those 19th century documents, with a kind of eye to what it is that they're condemning, it's not, you can read them in continuity, that there are different kinds of concerns, and that the Council Fathers, right, affirming Dignitatis Humanae, are also trying to make sure that they say that they're leaving the traditional teaching intact. So I think that's part of what's going on there. I think that there's also just a general sense, though. This isn't getting into maybe specific like Lefebvre himself, but in terms of just online Catholics and that sort of thing. I mean, I think that there's kind of a sense that the church was capitulating to the world, and that's part of also why there's a kind of rejection of some of these things.
Oh yeah, no, definitely that can be a kind of sense that I think some people have. And I definitely think that attitude of hermeneutic of continuity is important. We talked about that before. If you're listening, that's just the idea of reading all the documents in continuity together. We've talked about that once or twice beforehand, so I'm not going to explain that all again today. But now also after Vatican II, there's a few magisterial documents, but looking through, I didn't find a ton. The biggest thing I found was the Catechism, 2104 to 2109. Is there anything that really adds that that to Dignitatis Humanae, or makes clearer than Dignitatis Humanae did?
I mean, I don't know that you're going to find some. There was an ITC document, that International Theological Commission document, that sort of reflected on the years that have intervened, but I don't know that it adds to Dignitatis Humanae. The one thing I might say, though, on this question is, I think of Veritatis Splendor and Fides et Ratio as in a way follow-ups to Dignitatis Humanae, because they are so strong on affirming I don't remember if it was DC Schindler or David Schindler. One of the Schindlers talks about kind of like the structure of freedom and how it's ordered to truth, and that there's, John Paul II has a famous quote about there's no freedom without the truth. And so I think that those documents, those encyclicals that are so big on the importance of truth, objective truth, on that we can find the truth and rest in it, our reasoning, the kind of like the dignity of our reason. I think those sort of, in my way of reading these things, they sort of go well as follow-ups to Dignitatis Humanae, because Dignitatis Humanae is not just saying that there's just sort of a free-floating freedom, that that freedom is sort of meant to be ordered to truth, and that truth and freedom are bound up with each other, and those encyclicals sort of reinforce that, I think. So that's what I might commend to someone who reads Dignitatis Humanae. You might read Veritatis Splendor and Fides et Ratio later as kind of follow-ups to Dignitatis Humanae.
Oh yeah, definitely. And it's interesting how these encyclicals often have so many different connections within them. Like I just published a piece in the Journal of Moral Theology on the conscience in Veritatis Splendor and Amoris Laetitia, which is like also Veritatis Splendor, but a total aspect from what we're talking about right now with the kind of human dignity and seeking truth here. I think Dignitatis Humanae also has some practical aspects in the life of the church, and you might be, because you mentioned you're more on the advocacy side with the USCCB. On this, you might be able to explain more about how it practically affects the church, and in a practical way in a country like the US or Canada, which is where most of our listeners are located. What kind of practical effect does it have on work like yours promoting religious liberty?
Yeah, well, so one area, first I'll start off with maybe an area where can be a little bit of a tension is, in the United States, we have a very strong tradition of disestablishment. And I would say that as you read Dignitatis Humanae, it sort of leaves open the question, it's of whether or not you could have an established religion. And so, questions related to the Establishment Clause of the First Amendment are just issues we don't normally really get into, where we're really, a lot of our work at the Bishops' Conference is really focused on expanding free exercise of religion. So that's kind of where a lot of our focus ends up being. But I would say in terms of the practical upshot, and I mean, you're kind of seeing a theme here in the way I'm talking about this is we will pretty much always frame our issues in terms of truth. We talk about freedom in terms of human dignity. And I think that so when in our advocacy, and I think you will even see this in our comments when new regulations are proposed and we comment on regulations and in the rulemaking process, we will talk about issues in terms of truth, and the right to seek the truth and to live it out and to bear witness to it, as opposed to emphasizing our right or our own rights to autonomy. Even though it may be the case that there's a sense in which, yes, it's true, we have a right to live out our religion under our country's constitutional order. But the way we typically frame it is we try to frame it in these very Catholic terms. And so I do think the way we speak about religious liberty ends up being different than the way, we work with a lot of other groups who advocate for religious freedom, but we definitely bring a unique perspective to how we're promoting it.
Okay, yeah, definitely. Now, at the end of each episode, I give my guest of each interview episode, I give the guest opportunity to promote anything they're doing, which a lot of times is like their podcast or their book or something. I think you're more, have things that you might be doing now and they're at the USCCB that other people people in the pew might be interested in. What might you want to share with, people who are listening to this podcast?
Yeah, I'll mention two things. So if you go to our website, usccb.org/freedom, is the short URL, you can find a link. You should find it pretty easily to our annual report. And that's something you can see what we've done the past 2 years. But then when the next annual report comes out, this is sort of a recent initiative that we started. Those aren't going to focus as much on, we do have one very short chapter that just gives a quick summary of Catholic teaching on religious liberty. So you can kind of see how we put some of the things that we discussed here. But then it sort of really just lays out all of the issues that we're tracking. Some of these are things that you may know from reading the news, but some of the issues we raise, we identify, are maybe things that you wouldn't be so familiar with. So I think that that's a really good resource for Catholics who want to be kind of engaged in what the bishops are concerned about when it comes to religious liberty. I would also note that we did publish a very short book called In Accordance with Human Dignity. And it's a collection of very, very introductory essays on this topic, but we wanted to frame religious liberty in terms of Catholic social teaching more broadly. So it's got a chapter on the common good, chapter on church and state, and we had these were scholars that helped us. So we have Rick Garnett from Notre Dame contributed a couple of chapters, Joseph Capizzi from Catholic University, Angela Franks, Robert Wilkin. So we had several like really, really good teachers who contributed, they're kind of shorter essays, but I still think it's it's kind of geared to people who maybe aren't sort of in the weeds on this kind of stuff and who want a good introduction to what's going on. So I didn't name that as another book. It's Ascension Press published that book.
So thank you for being our guest here, Aaron. Did you have anything else to add before we conclude?
No, I don't think so. I appreciate the opportunity. This is kind of a little bit different for me. I normally am, and it was fun. It's fun for me to prepare for this. So thanks for the opportunity.
Excellent. Well, thank you for being here. And we will include a link to the usccb.org/freedom and the book you mentioned in the show notes. So for our listeners, thank you for listening to this episode of Vatican II in a Year. This is a listener-supported podcast, and you can donate to help StarQuest produce it and other great podcasts at sqpn.com/give. You can give one-time monthly or join the StarQuest Patreon. Tomorrow, we're going to start reading Dignitatis Humanae with paragraph 1 on religion expresses dignity. Please join us then to learn more about Vatican II, which provides a blueprint for the Catholic Church. If you want more information, like playlists on individual documents and a reading plan, go to sqpn.com/Vatican, frmatthewlc.com/Vatican, or Vatican SQPN on Facebook and X. We also set up an email for questions and comments at Vatican2@sqpn.com, or my own website, frmatthewlc.com, has a contact form.
Amen.